The most disturbing case ever revealed in the U.S. echoed through the corridors of the Louisville court, Kentucky in March 1963. He was forced to be his mother's husband. This phrase came to light when one of the most shocking cases of consanguinity already documented in American history was revealed from the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where generations of geographical isolation had created closed communities. For over 4 decades, the Harrington family had lived in absolute secret. Our understanding of the limits of human degradation would be forever changed by what happened on this 200-acre rural property. After the patriarch's premature death in a mining accident, Thomas Harrington, just 16 years old in 1943, was forced by his own father, Jeremiah Harrington, to assume marital responsibilities with his mother, Martha. What began as a distorted tradition of maintaining pure lineage turned into the most unimaginable nightmare a family could live. Hidden between centenary oak-covered hills and surrounded by a constant mist that seemed to protect its darker secrets, the Harrington property was 15 kilometers from the nearest city, Pineville. There, far from the eyes of society, 3 generations lived under rules created by the family founder, Ezekiel Harrington, who arrived in the region in 1897 obsessed with preserving what he called blood purity. In 1943, Martha Harrington, at 34, had lost her husband in a collapse in the local coal mine. With 5 children to raise and without financial resources, she was trapped in the family traditions imposed by her deceased father-in-law. The eldest son, Thomas, was chosen to assume the role of family protector, a cruel euphemism for what would really happen over the next 20 years. Described by neighbors as a shy, blue-eyed boy with brown hair, young Thomas had no choice. An environment where resistance was impossible was created by the social pressures of the time, combined with geographical isolation and financial dependence. He was forced to accept a union that violated all known social and moral norms. The family managed to maintain appearances during the early years. While Martha took care of her younger children, Thomas worked on the small family farm, cultivating corn and raising some cattle. For the few neighbors who occasionally visited, they were simply a mother and son struggling to survive after a family tragedy. But the truth was much more disturbing. Her first child with Thomas had been born to Martha in 1945. A girl with severe facial deformities and learning difficulties, who was called Sarah, had physical characteristics that already indicated the devastating effects of consanguinity: very close-set eyes, a cleft palate, and compromised mental development. A boy named David was born in 1947 as the second child. He developed chronic breathing problems and frequent seizures. The effects of endogamy began to manifest themselves more and more evidently, yet the family remained isolated without access to appropriate medical care or external guidance. Check to see if it's already registered on this channel to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. These are stories that society preferred to forget but need to be told to understand the limits of human degradation. The effects of consanguinity on the Harrington family became impossible to ignore by 1950, 7 years after the beginning of this forced union. Martha, now 41, had given birth to 4 children by Thomas, each with deformities and health problems more severe than the last. The third child, Michael, was born in 1949. He could never walk properly due to malformations in his lower limbs. His legs were disproportionate to his body, and his feet had fused toes, a condition known as syndactyly, common in cases of close consanguineous relationships. Born in 1952, the fourth child, Rebecca, had severe microcephaly. Indicating compromised brain development, her head was significantly smaller than normal. She never learned to talk or feed herself, remaining in a vegetative state throughout her brief life of just 8 years. Now 23, Thomas began to show signs of mental deterioration. The psychological weight of his situation, combined with the pressure to support a family under such adverse conditions, was charging its price. He developed episodes of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of absolute silence and explosions of anger directed at his own children. A scenario of progressive isolation had become the Harrington property. The children rarely left the farm, and when they did, they wore hats and clothes that hid their deformed features. Martha had developed a rigid control system, prohibiting any interaction with strangers and keeping the children busy with housework to prevent them from exploring beyond the property's limits. In 1953, the local church pastor, Reverend William Patterson, made an unannounced visit to the Harrington farm. What he found left him deeply disturbed: children with obvious deformities, precarious living conditions, and an environment loaded with tension and fear. While Martha explained the children's conditions as God's will, something in the family's behavior alarmed the religious man. The physical resemblance between Thomas and the younger children was noticed by Reverend Patterson. It was much more than would be expected in a half-sibling relationship. The family's characteristic blue eyes appeared more intensely, and certain birthmarks were statistically impossible in a normal family. Rebecca had one of her seizures common in children with severe microcephaly during this visit. Though Reverend Patterson offered medical help, Martha refused categorically, claiming that doctors did not understand the family's special condition. This refusal raised even more suspicions about what was really happening on that isolated property. Local church records indicate that Reverend Patterson tried to make more visits in the following months, but he always found the family absent or too busy to receive him. Theories about family curses and divine punishments began to be murmured by the region's religious community concerning the Harringtons. In 1954, the fifth child, James, was born. He presented the most severe set of deformities yet seen in the family. His hands had only 3 fingers each. He had heterochromia, eyes of different colors, and he developed a cardiac condition that severely limited his physical activities. James rarely cried or showed emotions, remaining in a state of apathy that worried even Martha. A severe drought came to Kentucky in 1958, forcing many rural families to seek government help. Having been able to stay isolated for 15 years, the Harrington family finally had to interact with external authorities when Martha was forced to request food assistance at the Pineville Social Services office. The social worker responsible for the case, Dorothy Mills, an experienced 45-year-old woman graduated from the University of Louisville, was immediately alert when she first saw the Harrington children. Their physical deformities were consistent with patterns she had studied in cases of consanguinity during her academic training. Dorothy noted that Sarah, now 13, had not only facial deformities but also a characteristic speech pattern of severe intellectual disability. David, 11, breathed with difficulty and had frequent fainting episodes. Michael, 9, needed support to walk, and James, 4, remained completely apathetic throughout the interview. Dorothy discovered inconsistencies in the family documents during the routine investigation to approve social assistance. The birth records of the youngest children listed Thomas as the father, but there was no marriage record for Thomas and any woman. When asked about the children's mother, Martha presented contradictory and evasive explanations. The social worker decided to make unannounced home visits to evaluate the family's living conditions. On her first visit in September 1958, she found Thomas and Martha sharing the same room, while the 5 children slept in a room without proper ventilation. A marital relationship between mother and son was clearly suggested by the configuration of the house. Dorothy confronted Martha about the situation but received only vehement denials and threats that the family would move if she continued to persecute them. However, the social worker had seen enough to suspect she was facing a case of consanguinity and child neglect. It was during this investigation that Dorothy discovered something even more disturbing. Talking to James, the 4-year-old repeated a phrase he had heard from the adults: "Dad Thomas is Mom Martha's brother." This innocent revelation from a child confirmed the social worker's suspicions about the true nature of the family relationship. The moment you hear an innocent child repeat words that reveal the horror of your own existence, you realize that some secrets are too heavy to be buried. Leave a comment telling which part of this story impacted you the most so far. Dorothy Mills immediately contacted the local sheriff, Robert Kane, a 52-year-old man who had served the community for over 2 decades. When she shared her discoveries, the sheriff initially showed resistance to believing the situation's severity. Though whispered about in rural communities, cases of consanguinity were rarely officially investigated. However, the evidence presented by Dorothy was too convincing to be ignored. A disturbing picture that demanded immediate investigation was painted by the children's deformities, combined with the domestic configuration and James's innocent statement. Sheriff Robert Kane obtained a search warrant to officially investigate the Harrington property in October 1958. They arrived at the farm on a hazy morning that seemed to mirror the dark atmosphere they would find, accompanied by social worker Dorothy Mills and county doctor Dr. Henry Morrison. Dr. Morrison, a graduate of the University of Kentucky School of Medicine with experience in basic genetics, was critical for documenting the children's conditions. His exam revealed a consistent pattern of congenital malformations he described as textbook examples of inbreeding depression. Sarah, now 13, had not only severe facial deformities but also progressive scoliosis that was compromising her respiratory capacity. Dr. Morrison documented that her mental age corresponded approximately to that of a 6-year-old child and that she had developed repetitive behaviors characteristic of autistic spectrum disorders. Diagnosed with a congenital cardiac condition that severely limited his life expectancy was David, at age 11. His lungs were underdeveloped, and he had episodes of cyanosis, a bluish skin color indicative of inadequate blood oxygenation. Dr. Morrison estimated that David would not live beyond 15 years without medical intervention. Michael, 9 years old, had such severe bone malformations that Dr. Morrison recommended multiple surgeries, simply not available in Kentucky's rural medicine in 1958. His legs were of different lengths, and his hips were misaligned in a way that caused constant pain. James, the youngest at 4, had the most complex set of medical problems. In addition to visible physical deformities, Dr. Morrison found that he had mild hydrocephalus, an accumulation of fluid in the brain, which explained his extremely limited mental development and constant apathy. Under legal pressure and in the face of irrefutable medical evidence, Martha finally confessed to the true nature of her relationship with Thomas during the investigation. She admitted that she had been forced by circumstances and family traditions to maintain a union with her own son after her husband's death in 1943. Now 31, Thomas showed obvious signs of psychological deterioration. During his testimony, he alternated between periods of lucidity, where he expressed deep remorse for his situation, and episodes of mental confusion, where he seemed not to fully understand what had happened in his life. The investigation also revealed that Martha had suffered multiple miscarriages over the years, a common consequence of close consanguinity. Dr. Morrison estimated that, considering the 5 surviving children, Martha had likely been pregnant at least 10 times, with half of the pregnancies resulting in natural losses due to genetic incompatibilities. The case gained regional attention when Louisville newspapers published stories about Kentucky's most isolated family. The local community was divided between those who expressed compassion for the family's tragic situation and others who showed revulsion and demanded severe punishment. The Bell County Court decided to separate the children from their parents in December 1958. Sarah, David, Michael, and James were placed in different care institutions for children with severe disabilities. Rebecca had died 2 years earlier due to complications related to her microcephaly. In January 1959, Thomas Harrington was sentenced to 15 years in prison for crimes against morals and customs, a legal terminology of the time that encompassed incestuous relationships. Martha received a 10-year sentence, but due to her status as a victim of circumstance, she served only 4 years in a psychiatric institution. The fate of the Harringtons became one of the most documented cases of consanguinity in 20th-century American medical literature. Sarah was admitted to Danville State Hospital, where she remained until her death in 1967 at age 22 due to respiratory complications related to her congenital deformities. David, as predicted by Dr. Morrison, died in 1962 at age 15 during experimental heart surgery at the University of Louisville. His death was documented in medical studies on the cardiovascular effects of close consanguinity, contributing to scientific knowledge about inbreeding. Michael lived until he was 25, remaining in specialized institutional care. Despite his severe physical limitations, he developed some basic communication skills and showed affection for his caregivers. His death in 1974 was caused by kidney complications related to his congenital malformations. James, the youngest, surprised doctors by living until he was 31. He died in 1985. Although he never developed mental abilities beyond those of a 3-year-old child, he found some quality of life in a specialized institution where he received appropriate care for the first time in his life. The Harrington property was abandoned after the family's arrest. The wooden house rapidly deteriorated, and nature began to reclaim the land that had witnessed so much suffering. Today, only the stone foundations remain visible, covered by dense vegetation that hides the physical traces of this tragedy. The Harrington case significantly influenced social assistance policies in Kentucky. Dorothy Mills, the social worker who discovered the case, became a national defender of children's rights and helped establish more rigorous protocols for identifying cases of neglect and consanguineous relationships in isolated rural communities. Thomas was released from prison in 1967 but was never able to reintegrate into society. He spent the last years of his life in a small boarding house in Louisville, working manual jobs and avoiding social contact. He died in 1983 at age 56 from alcoholism-related liver cirrhosis, a form of escape he had found to deal with the trauma of his life. After her release in 1963, Martha moved to a small town in Tennessee, where she assumed a new identity. She worked as a housekeeper until her retirement and died in 1979, taking her secrets to the grave. She never had contact with any of her surviving children after leaving the psychiatric institution. The scientific legacy of the Harringtons has contributed to important research on the effects of consanguinity in isolated human populations. Medical studies based on the children helped establish early identification protocols for endogamy-related malformations and influenced public health policies in rural communities. This case remains a dark reminder of how isolation, distorted traditions, and extreme circumstances can lead whole families into the deepest degradation. The highest possible price was paid by the Harrington family for traditions that prioritized blood purity over basic human well-being. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Subscribe to discover other equally disturbing cases that have remained hidden for decades. Leave your like if this story has impacted you, and share it so that more people know these accounts that society preferred to forget but need to be told to understand the limits of the human condition.